Hello everyone and welcome to my channel. Let's skip. In this video and in the next, I will talk about animation. I have to warn, in animation, I got a lot of practice to do in order to get better. I know things, concepts, and how to apply them. That's why I will talk about them, but I highly recommend in order to get better at this, into doing your research, read articles, watch tutorials, and practice, right? So what is animation? Animation conceptually is a sequence of frames that create an illusion of movement. So you cannot, for example, have an animation of only one frame because it is not a sequence of images to create illusion of movement. If it is only one frame, probably it is an optical illusion, right? To animate something, it is really important to decide what action you want to occur, to happen. Planning before you do anything is actually the best thing you possibly can do. In animation, we have three ways of handle animation. So the first one is ongoing, that you create a frame and go to the other one. This type of animation usually have a lot of natural feeling of what is happening, but it might feels weird because there is no structure for the movement. So it will feel natural, but actually there are a lot of things that might be inconsistent throughout the frames that will be not visually appealing and actually maybe cannot even make sense, such as have different heights when actually you have an static floor, for example. The other one is using keyframes. So basically, imagine your action you want to animate. So you have the idea what to animate. So actually, you make the frames for the most important part of that animation, and each frame you already have a reference to look at and check if you are doing everything right. But there is a problem with this. The downsides of this type of animation, usually everything will feel very mechanical, might not feel natural, just it might not have appeal. And we have the third way to do it, that is basically merging both, actually a hybrid version. So you have the keyframes for the action. For example, in this case, I have the first one and the last one, and I make the frames in the middle of these two keyframes ongoing. So now I have the stability of the keyframes plus the creativity and a natural flow of the frames. So each important frame is called keyframe, and you might have any number of frames between two frames. So actually, for example, you might have 1, 2, 3, 4. How an action will be developed between two keyframes. On breakdowns, you might actually do certain things, such as exaggeration, in order to convey or transmit even more a feeling or an idea or the mood and so on. So usually breakdowns is more than just a frame that is between two keyframes. It's actually the development, not only the emotional part, but as well how spontaneous we refer to animations based on how many frames within 1000 milliseconds, or actually 1 second, frames has passed. You might have an animation that 60 frames pass within 1 second, or 30, or 24, or 12. All this influence the general feeling of your animation. So the default number of frames in this industry is 24, and this leads to a concept that is called animating on ones or twos. That is, when you are animating in ones, basically within 1 second, 24 frames will be created in order to animate that scene, and this is animating on once. But sometimes, so for any reasons, you might actually, instead of 24 frames per second, you might want 12 frames per second. Usually it's to save some time. You will create one frame for every two of animations. In this case, you are animating on twos. But how to decide the frame rate of your animation? Well, mostly stylistic choice, because for example, you might have animations on games, for example, that is made out of two frames. Walk cycles made of two frames. Obviously, and they are exceptions because the default number of walk cycles usually floats between 6 and 12 frames per second. But in our case, pixel art animations and usually for games, this is the standard, but you can get out of it whenever you want. And actually, having a set frame rate is not ideal for us. Usually, the most important part is how impactful each frame might be, and this will actually affect how long a frame will be held in animation, and we will end up, for example, with different frame rates for animations of the same character. So actually, the framing time is more important than follow the FPS set for the whole animation. Here on the sprite, you are able to access the frame rate by clicking in frame properties, and here we will set the duration or how long a frame will be held in milliseconds. So for example, I have 4 frames of 100 milliseconds. So actually this animation is like 10 FPS. So in order to be 12, I need to set each frame to something close to 83 or 84 milliseconds. So now this is on 12 frames per second. But as I said, sometimes, for example, you are making a punch animation. The anticipation that I will talk later and the end frame might actually be held because of cooldown, for example, or to give more impact of that animation. So do not be too attached to the frame rate. And we also have configurations of ghosting or onion skin. So that is basically your possibility to preview the previous and the next frame of your animation. So for example, in this frame 2, I have the both ghost, and actually you can might even be more specific and use this red and blue tint. So now my next frame will be blue and my previous frame will be red. So I have tracking of these frames. But this might be a little bit distracting for some people. Not everyone uses the onion skin. Before we continue, there is a really important part of animation, that is the how clear something it is transmitted. Usually on animation you have a lot of exaggeration in order to make an action being clear. So this exaggeration is usually very good to turn any action more comprehensible for the viewer. I will just say a lot of concepts that is used on animation. First one and the most classic one is the squash and stretch. So when something is either change the velocity, mainly accelerating or deaccelerating, their bodies will be deformed in order to transmit that feeling of movement. As I said, exaggeration is a really important tool, and you have something moving, accelerating in a certain direction, following the Newton's law. Part of their body will suffer from inertia, but their mass should be preserved. So, in order to transmit that idea, so actually the body will be stretched in the direction of the movements. If something is moving vertically, their body will stretch vertically. If something is moving horizontally, their body will be deformed horizontally. And when this body that is accelerated deaccelerate, as I said about the same law is applied. So the first part of the body will stop, but the rest will keep going, and their masses should be preserved. So actually, they squash in the opposite direction of their initial movement. So if something is moving horizontally, their body will be squashed vertically and vice versa. The most used example is a ball that jumps and falls. For example, this one will fall. In order to make this believable, I need to squash the body vertically. That is where accelerating. And when this ball falls and hit the ground, this part will stop, but the rest will continue. So actually it will squash sideways. Yeah, so here is an attempt of to show you how this works. So the ball fall and stretch vertically. Hitting the ground, it squash and expands horizontally, and it prepares to jump again. When it jumps, it also stretch, and in the middle of the air, when it deaccelerates, it squash once again. We also have the principle of anticipation. When you have, for example, one keyframe such as this one and the other one such as this one, as I said in animation, the exaggeration is a really important thing. So if this something like a bat is swinging in that direction, I could use the exaggeration of this animation actually being pulled even further of this first movement in order to anticipate the real movement. So actually, instead of this bat going that direction, so actually we'll go even further. And now I will make a between, a breakdown. Actually, I will use even one more frame in order to make this. I will hold this last a bit more. So now I have the anticipation of that movement. We also have the principle of easing in out. The easing is when you have a clear acceleration of the movement. So for example, if my keyframe is here and the next one is here, and my breakdown is, for example, in here, I could transmit the accelerating feeling actually by adding more breakdowns between these two frames. So actually, now I will have, for example, something here in the middle and one more now in this middle. So now I am accelerating in that direction. We also have the upside, that is the acceleration of the movement. My breakdowns will be concentrated in the last half of that animation. And obviously, you are able to use both of them, accelerating and deaccelerating. There is also another important thing that is about holding. So how long a frame should be held? Well, usually is how impactful that action is. So for example, in anticipation, usually the extreme action will be hold a bit and the end as well because there is an impact. Normal animations such as these smooth movements does not need holds, but when something needs to be impactful, such as punches, fallings, destructions, usually we have hold when the impact occurs. We also have arcs. Arcs was observed to be the most natural trajectory of movement made from living beings. So actually, unless something should be mechanical or robotic, it won't move in a straight line, probably moves on arcs. So for example, imagine this is a head of a person while walking. Well, usually the movement of the head will be something like floating. It would be something like this, and actually this is kinda following these sort of waves that actually could be breakdown as arcs as well. When something is moving really fast, we do not need to make every single frame in order to transmit action, but we can use things in order to transmit that action. And one of the most used things are smears. Smears is like a distorted figure, like a ghost of that subject is left behind, and we have a sort of colors that represent that figure, hinting action. For example, if I have this bat swinging, I could use, for example, sort of arcs, smears, and transmit this is moving. So now there is a feeling of movement from here to here. It's not that snappy and choppy feeling. This could be interpreted as the same thing of motion blur. When something is moving really fast and our eye is not capturing everything, there is sort of a ghost or a distorted image, or even only the colors are left behind of that movement. We also have something called parallax effect. Probably you already heard about this. Basically, things that are closer to us have the feeling of moving faster than something that is far behind. If these two balls are moving in the same direction, the ball that is further from me would move way slower. So we have the feeling of things that are closer to us is moving faster than the things that are further from us. We also have something called overshooting. That is when the final keyframe of an action is actually pushed a little bit further to emphasize that action. So for example, if I have this bat swing and this is my final frame, I could actually have a frame before this one and make this bat actually going further than the final position. So actually it will kind of bounce back, and we now have the emphasis of that final action. We also have overlapping that could be interpreted as if we have more than one action happening at the same time, they occurs in a different timing. So for example, if I have these two balls and both are accelerating, I might actually delay one of them in order to make this animation more interesting. So overlapping usually happens in order to make something more natural. So for example, when you are breathing, your head will move in a different speed of your shoulders, that is also moving differently from your torso, that is moving also different from your arms. Parallels actions happen different times makes the animation in overall more interesting. We also have falling through, that is when actions could be tied together, but one of them is kind of delayed because they are more of a secondary animation. So for example, if I have these semi two balls moving and I have, for example, a small hat, top hat in this one, for example, I could make follow through of this animation. For example, this hat being kind of left behind and then picking up the pace of the ball, for example. So as you can see, this had follow that ball I kind of made as a secondary action tied to the first one, following through the same path, the same journey of that animation. Pixel art has something called sub-pixel animation. Well, we cannot move things less than 1 pixel, but we actually can fake this movement, usually with anti-aliasing. And why is this interesting? Because we can make our animation even more smoother since we are dealing with pixels. Most part of the animations will be felt as choppy and snappy. So we kinda get rid of this feeling by this sub-pixeling animation. How we do this could be done in the silhouette, like in the extremes of that shape of the form, or inside of that silhouette, so inside of the limit of our subject. We'll smooth out different parts because one of them will actually smooth out the exterior part of our animation and the other one will smooth out the inner part of our movement. Both can be done in order to transmit these. For example, I have this purple ball and this dark background. So actually, I will this ball 2 pixels and more 2 pixels. So as you can see, this is very snappy. So how can we fix this? So first, by smoothing out the silhouette, what I will do, I will add in-betweens of this frame. I will pick the color that I would use to smooth this color transition and I will place in the part of the subject that would be left behind. I'm really just placing my anti-aliasing where I would normally place, but only on the other extreme of my movement. So if I'm moving vertically, my anti-aliasing will be placed vertically as well, but in the upper part, and vice versa. And if I'm moving horizontally to the right, for example, I would place the anti-aliasing in the left, and so on. So now I will also smooth out this part. And now, as you can see, instead of having 3 frames where the last two would move only 1 pixel, I have 4 frames now. The first one is moving but being smoothed out. The second one is also moving 1 pixel but having even more anti-aliasing. And the last one not moving at all. So actually, I smoothed out the frame in the middle with anti-aliasing. So now it is perceived as something smoother. And I can also do this inside of the silhouette. So for example, now if I have this, for example, in the middle of this ball, and I want this move 1 pixel, instead of having the snappy animation, I could duplicate this last frame and smooth out the pixels that would move vertically more abruptly. This is good, for example, for idle animations where you don't need actually to move the whole silhouette up and down. You might actually only move the face or the hair or the chest or in equipment, for example, less than 1 pixel. So I will stop for now. I will record one more video about animation.